June 12, 1944. The silence was the first clue. The Luftwaffe airfield outside St. Lo was supposed to be a hive of activity, a constant roar of engines and shouted commands. But as Captain John Miller of the Office of Strategic Services watched through his binoculars from a nearby ridge, the field was unnervingly still. No mechanics scurried under the wings of the Messerschmitt fighters. No fuel trucks moved between the hangars. The only movement was a flock of crows, wheeling and landing on the tarmac, pecking at something unseen. Then he saw the reason for the silence. Parked in neat rows, the German planes were not being prepared for flight. They were being dismantled. But not by mechanics, by teams of men in bulky, unfamiliar protective suits. Their movements were slow, deliberate, and deeply wrong. And around the landing gear of several aircraft, dark, scorched marks spiderwebbed across the concrete. There had been explosions, but there were no craters, no shrapnel damage. It was as if the bombs had detonated from within the planes themselves. Miller's mission was simple reconnaissance, to confirm the airfield's strength, but this was something else. This was an unanswered mystery. That night, under the cover of a moonless sky, he infiltrated the perimeter. The airfield was even more eerie up close. The silence was broken only by the cawing of crows and the low electric hum of generators powering lights around the main hangar. He moved like a ghost, avoiding the patrols of the men in suits. He found his way to a trash dump at the edge of the field. Among the usual refuse of a military base, he saw them. Dozens of dead crows. Their bodies were not torn by bullets or predators. They were intact, but their beaks were slightly agape, and a fine black dust coated their feathers. He carefully collected one of the birds, wrapping it in an oilcloth, but it was what he found next that made his blood run cold. Half buried in the dirt was a small metal canister. It was not German. It was American. O.S.S. issue. The label was faded, but he could just make out the words Project Hive, and a series of handling instructions that included extreme biocontainment protocols. His own people had done this. Back at his safe house in a nearby village, he pried open the canister with trembling hands. Inside, nestled in a bed of fine, dark powder, were hundreds of tiny, seed-like objects. They were no larger than a grain of rice, and intricately carved from a dull grey metal. They were not seeds. They were micro-explosives. A memory clicked into place. The crows, the black dust on their feathers, the explosions from within the aircraft. The birds were not scavengers. They were the delivery system. The OSS had created a weapon so subtle, so insidious, it was almost invisible. Tiny, explosive seeds that would cling to the feathers of birds. When the birds landed on the airfield, seeking food or water, the seeds would be brushed off. They would fall into air intakes, into delicate engine mechanisms, into fuel vents. And then, triggered by a timed chemical reaction or a simple pressure switch, they would detonate. It was sabotage on a molecular scale. A silent, deniable war waged by nature itself. But the mission had gone wrong. The canister had been lost or discarded. The birds had ingested the poisonous carrier powder, killing them. The Germans had discovered the plot, and were now trying to decontaminate their airfield. Miller's simple reconnaissance was over. He now held in his hand the evidence of a secret and terrifyingly elegant black operation. An operation that had failed, and now threatened to expose the entire OSS network in France. He had to find the missing unit that had deployed this weapon, and he had to find out why the Germans, instead of screaming for vengeance, were working in such silent, secretive horror. June 13th, 1944. The dead crow lay on the rough wooden table in the safe house, a silent accusation. Captain Miller stared at the tiny metallic seeds in the open canister. Project Hive. The name was a sickening mockery of nature. He had to move. The OSS, a cell that deployed this, was compromised. The Germans were onto them. He had to find them before the Gestapo did. His contact in the French resistance, a woman named Elise with eyes that had seen too much, provided a name, Dr. Laurent, a botanist from the University of Caen, recruited for his expertise in seed dispersal. He was the only local asset with the knowledge to modify such a weapon. He had gone into hiding a week ago, after a failed supply drop. Elise led Miller to a dilapidated greenhouse on the outskirts of the city. The glass was mostly shattered, the plants within withered and brown. But in the back, behind a false wall of empty pots, they found a small workroom, and they found Dr. Laurent. He was a thin, nervous man, his fingers stained with soil and something darker. He looked at Miller not with relief, but with terror. "You are too late," Laurent whispered, his voice cracking. "They are not just cleaning the airfield. They are collecting them, the seeds." "Collecting them for what?" Miller demanded. "They're just tiny bombs." Laurent shook his head, a frantic, jerky motion. "You do not understand. The compound in the seeds. It is not just an explosive. It is a catalyst. My work was only on the dispersal mechanism, the coating that attracts the birds, the core chemistry. It was provided by your people, from a different project. They called it the Kronos compound." Miller felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. Kronos. Time. He had heard that word in whispers, in classified briefings about things that were not to be discussed. "The Germans," Laurent continued, his eyes wide. "They are not trying to disarm the seeds, they are harvesting them. I overheard 2 of the officers in the suits. They said the compound creates a temporal instability, a localized rupture in causality. When it detonates, it does not just destroy, it unmakes. It sends the target a few seconds into the past, superimposed over its own existence. The stress is catastrophic. It tears the metal apart from the inside. That explained the scorch marks with no shrapnel. The planes were being torn apart by a paradox." "The crows," Miller said, thinking of the dead birds. "The carrier powder is toxic to them, yes," Laurent said. "But the ones that survive, the ones that ingest the active compound." He shuddered. "They become wrong. They move in flickers. They are in 2 places at once. The German officers, they shoot them on sight. They are afraid of them. This was no longer a sabotage mission. It was a breach. The OSS had been experimenting with a temporal weapon, and a piece of it had fallen into enemy hands. The Germans, with their own occult research branches, were now trying to understand it, to weaponize it themselves." Elise, who had been listening silently by the door, suddenly held up a hand. "Voices!" Outside, Miller peered through a crack in the boarded-up window. A black Citroën Traction Avant, the preferred car of the Gestapo, had pulled up quietly. 3 men in long leather coats were getting out. "They found us," Miller said flatly. He grabbed the canister of seeds and Laurent's notes, shoving them into his pack. There was a back door, leading into an overgrown cemetery. They slipped out just as the front door of the greenhouse splintered under a heavy boot. They ran through the gravestones, the sounds of pursuit close behind. Miller knew they would not make it far. He made a split-second decision. He shoved the canister and notes into Elise's hands. "Get these to the rally point. Get them to London." "What about you?" she asked, her eyes wide. "I'm the distraction," he said, turning and raising his Thompson submachine gun. "Go!" He fired a long burst back toward the greenhouse, the roar of the gun shattering the quiet of the cemetery. He saw the Gestapo men dive for cover. He turned and ran in the opposite direction of Elise and the doctor, leading the hunters away. The chase was a blur of crumbling headstones and shouted German. He was cornered against a high stone wall at the cemetery's edge. He was out of ammunition. This was it. But as the lead Gestapo agent rounded a large mausoleum, a sudden, silent flash of darkness descended from a yew tree, a crow. It moved with a jerky, unnatural speed, like a poorly projected film. It flew directly into the man's face. The agent screamed, not in pain, but in sheer primal terror. He stumbled back, clawing at the bird, which seemed to phase in and out of existence, its talons scratching at his eyes 1 second, and then being several feet away the next. In the confusion, Miller found a foothold and scrambled over the wall, dropping into a narrow alley on the other side. He had escaped. But he knew the truth now. The tiny explosive seeds were not just destroying planes, They were poisoning time itself. And the birds, the innocent carriers, were becoming the first victims of a war that was tearing at the very fabric of reality. The mission had just become infinitely more dangerous. June 14th, 1944. The alley was cold and damp, the scent of rotting garbage, a stark contrast to the ozone and blood smell of the cemetery. Captain Miller leaned against the wet brick, his heart hammering. The image of the flickering crow attacking the Gestapo agent was burned into his mind. It wasn't just a bird. It was a glitch, a tear in the world. And he had unleashed it. He had to get back to the airfield. Laurent's revelation changed everything. The Germans weren't just victims of a sabotage plot. They were active researchers, harvesting the Kronos compound for their own ends. He needed to see what they were doing with it. By nightfall, he was back on the ridge, his binoculars trained on the hangar. The men in protective suits were still there, but their work had intensified. They were no longer just inspecting planes. They were loading crates into the back of a covered truck, but the crates were small, no larger than ammunition boxes, and they were handled with extreme care, placed in cushioned racks inside the vehicle. This was the harvest. They were gathering the unstable seeds. As he watched, a new figure emerged from the hangar, a man in a long, dark coat, not a protective suit. He carried a briefcase and spoke with the officer in charge. Even from a distance, his posture radiated an authority that was more academic than military. This was not a Luftwaffe officer. This was a scientist, perhaps from the Ahnenerbe, the Nazi occult research branch. Miller had to know where that truck was going. He tracked it from the ridge as it left the airfield, its headlights off, navigating by the faint light of a half-moon. It moved north, away from the front lines, into the dense bocage country. The journey was slow, the truck taking a circuitous route along farm tracks and forgotten lanes. After 2 hours, it arrived at its destination. Not a military base, but an abandoned monastery, its Gothic spires clawing at the night sky. The place was supposed to be empty, deconsecrated years before the war. But as the truck approached, a section of the hillside beside the monastery entrance swung open, revealing a modern, concrete tunnel. The truck drove inside, and the door slid shut, vanishing once more into the landscape. This was the place. A hidden laboratory. Getting inside was the work of a patient hour. He found a secondary entrance, a drainage culvert that fed into an underground stream running beneath the monastery. It was a tight, freezing crawl through pitch-black water, but it brought him up into a cellar filled with old, rotting wine barrels. From there, he found a staircase leading up. The upper levels were a bizarre fusion of the ancient and the advanced. Stone corridors from the Middle Ages were now lined with electrical conduit and hissed with pressurized air lines. He followed the hum of machinery. It led him to the monastery's old chapel. The pews were gone. The stained glass windows were covered by blackout curtains. In the center of the vaulted space, under the very spot where an altar would have been, stood a machine. It was a smaller, more refined version of the temporal resonators he had encountered before. Wires snaked from it to a series of glass cages lining the walls, and in those cages were crows. Dozens of them. Some were dead, lying stiff on the floor. Others were alive, but they were wrong. They flickered, their forms shifting, their cores emerging as distorted, slowed-down echoes. They were living ghosts, trapped between moments. The German scientist in the dark coat was there, observing a monitor connected to the machine. On the screen, a waveform pulsed erratically. "The subject's temporal signature is decaying," the scientist said to an assistant. "The compound is too unstable. We cannot stabilize a conscious mind within the field. The avians expire within hours. A human subject would last mere seconds." "So the compound is useless for transportation?" the assistant asked. "Not useless," the scientist corrected. "As a weapon, it is unparalleled. A single seed can destroy a tank by forcing its armor to occupy the same space as itself from 3 seconds prior. But Project Nutchen promised more. It promised a door. And this is only a key that breaks the lock." Miller's blood ran cold. They were talking about the same project. The temporal research was connected. The Avalon Group's work, the OSS desperate theft of it, the Nazis' attempts to replicate it, it was all one sprawling, hidden war. He needed proof. He needed data. He waited until the scientist and his assistant left for a break, then slipped into the room. He went to the main console, pulling a small camera from his pack. He began photographing the schematics, the logs, everything. He was so focused he didn't hear the soft click of a safety being disengaged behind him. "Turn around slowly, Captain," a voice said in perfect, unaccented English. Miller froze. He turned. It was the scientist. He held a Luger pistol, aimed steadily at Miller's heart. But his eyes were not on Miller. They were on the camera. "You are looking for answers," the scientist said. "But you do not know the questions. The Chronos compound is not a weapon we invented. It is a substance we discovered, a residue, from something that fell here long ago. Your people stole a sample. We are merely trying to understand what we already had." He gestured with the gun toward the crows. "You see the cost. This technology is not for us. It is not for any man. It is a fire that will consume the one who wields it. Your Operation Hive, our Project Nachan. We are all just children, playing with a loaded gun." "Then stop," Miller said. "It is too late for that," the scientist replied, a sad smile on his face. "The genie is out of the bottle. And now, you have seen the lamp." His finger tightened on the trigger, but from one of the glass cages, a crow that was mid-flicker let out a final, distorted caw. The sound seemed to resonate with the machine. The waveform on the monitor spiked violently. The scientist flinched, his head snapping toward the screen for a fraction of a second. It was all the opening Miller needed. June 15th, 1944. The world dissolved into a scream of tortured physics. Captain Miller did not tackle the scientist. He did not dive for cover. He threw himself backward, toward the chapel's stone wall, as the scientist's Luger fired. The bullet did not whistle past his ear. It stuttered, a rapid-fire pop-pop-pop sound as it crossed through a suddenly unstable patch of air, its trajectory weaving like a dying wasp before embedding itself harmlessly in the floor. The spike from the monitor had been a warning. The entire laboratory was experiencing a cascade failure. The machine, stressed by the dying crow's distorted temporal signature, was overloading. The air itself began to shimmer, to fracture. Miller saw the scientist flicker, his form splitting into 3 translucent copies, all wearing identical expressions of horror before they collapsed into one another and vanished with a sound like tearing silk. The glass cages containing the crows exploded, but the shards did not fly outward. They hung in the air, vibrating, each piece showing a different moment in time, a crow alive, a crow dead, a crow mid-flicker. The birds themselves were gone, unmade by the paradox they helped create. A low whine built from the central machine, climbing into a deafening roar. The stone walls of the ancient chapel began to sweat, moisture beading and running upward toward the ceiling. Gravity was becoming a suggestion. Miller scrambled for the cellar entrance, his movements feeling thick and slow, as if he were pushing through deep water. He glanced back once. The machine was the epicenter of a silent storm. It was not exploding. It was unwinding. Pieces of it were peeling away into nothingness, the very molecules of its construction surrendering to entropy. He tumbled down the cellar steps just as a wave of absolute silence rolled out from the chapel. It was not an absence of sound, but an annihilation of it. The roar was gone, the humming was gone, replaced by a profound nothing that felt heavier than any noise. He plunged into the icy water of the underground stream and fought his way back through the culvert. When he finally emerged, gasping, into the night air, the world seemed strangely normal. The monastery stood silent against the sky, but no light came from within, no sound. It was just a ruin again. He made his way back to a secondary safe house, his mind reeling. He had the camera, he had the proof, but the cost was staggering. The scientist was gone, the laboratory was gone, erased. Days later, holed up in a farmhouse attic awaiting extraction, he developed the film. The photographs were chilling, schematics of the resonator. log entries detailing the failed avian experiments, and one page, half-glimpsed, that made his blood run cold. It was a memo on OSS letterhead authorizing the transfer of the Kronos compound sample to Operation Hive. It was signed by a man he knew, a man named Albright. This was not a rogue operation. This was sanctioned. Albright, and whoever he answered to, had known the risks. They had known they were playing with a substance that could unmake reality. The tiny explosive seeds were just a cover, a field test for a far more terrifying application. His radio crackled to life with a secure frequency. It was Albright himself. Miller. Report. We lost contact with the Hive cell. The airfield is still operational. The mission is a failure. Miller keyed the microphone, his voice cold. The mission was never about the airfield, was it? It was a field test for the compound. You were using the Luftwaffe as lab rats. There was a long silence on the other end. The strategic implications of that compound are beyond your clearance, Captain. And the Crows? The men who were erased? What were the implications for them? Regrettable collateral damage in a war we cannot afford to lose by conventional means. Albright's voice was smooth, devoid of emotion. Now, your extraction point is compromised. New coordinates are being transmitted. We will debrief you in London. The transmission ended. Miller looked at the coordinates. They were for a field miles from any friendly position. A trap. He was now a loose end. A man who knew that his own side was willing to break time itself to win. He grabbed his pack, the camera, and its damning film inside. He would not go to the extraction point. He was on his own. The secret of the tiny explosive seeds was not just a weapon. It was a key to a door his own superiors were desperate to open. And Captain Miller was now the only one standing in their way. June 16th, 1944. The new coordinates were a death sentence. Captain Miller knew it with a cold certainty. Albright was not offering extraction. He was arranging a termination. The knowledge in his camera was too dangerous. It proved that elements within the OSS were experimenting with forces that could erase men from time itself. He was now an enemy of his own side. He moved not to the coordinates, but away from them, deeper into the contested countryside. His goal was to reach a British intelligence unit he had worked with before, men who might be outside Albright's reach. It was a thin hope, but it was all he had. He travelled by night, hiding by day in bombed-out barns and dense hedgerows. The world felt different now. Every distant aircraft might be searching for him. Every farmhouse might conceal an OSS cleanup team. The psychological tension was a constant, grinding weight. He was alone in a land of enemies, hunted by both sides. After 2 days of this fugitive existence, he stumbled upon a scene of utter devastation. A small village, wiped from the map by artillery. Among the rubble, he found a single, shocking point of order. A makeshift field hospital, marked by a red cross on a white sheet, set up in the relatively intact cellar of a collapsed church. He entered cautiously. A lone British medic, his uniform caked in dirt and blood, was tending to a single patient, a child, a boy of no more than 7, sitting silently on a cot, staring at the wall. He was physically unharmed, but his eyes were vacant, deep pools of trauma. The medic looked up, his exhaustion evident. "American? You're a long way from your unit, mate." "Something like that," Miller said, his voice rough. "What happened here?" "German shelling, a few days ago. Wiped out most everyone." "I found him in the rubble." The medic nodded at the boy. "He hasn't spoken a word. Just sits there. It's like he's not all here." Miller approached the boy slowly. The child did not react. He was drawing in the dirt floor with a stick. Not pictures of houses or soldiers. He was drawing complex, interlocking circles and jagged lines. One of the symbols made Miller's heart stop. It was the circle with 3 cracks, the Avalon symbol. "He's been drawing that all day," the medic said, noting Miller's reaction. "You know what it means?" Before Miller could answer, the boy's head snapped up. His eyes were no longer vacant. They were focused, sharp, and filled with a terrifying ancient knowledge. He looked directly at Miller. "The song is broken," the boy said, his voice a clear, calm monotone. "The man with the watch cannot fix it. The bad metal birds fell from the sky because the sky was tired of holding them." Miller knelt. "What man with a watch?" "The loud man. The angry man." He tried to make the song go backwards, but it only made the silence louder. The boy pointed a thin finger at Miller's pack, where the camera was stored. "You have a piece of the silence. It hurts my teeth." Miller felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp cellar. This child was not just traumatized, he was sensitive. He could perceive the temporal distortions, the silence left by the Kronos compound. He was talking about Albright, the man with the watch, trying to reverse engineer time. "The birds," Miller pressed gently. "The crows. What happened to them?" "Their song got stuck," the boy whispered, his eyes widening. "They are singing the same note forever and ever. It is a very sad note." He began to rock back and forth. "The man with the watch wants to make everyone sing that note, to make the whole world quiet." The medic stared, his face pale. "What in God's name is he talking about?" "He's talking about the end of the war," Miller said, his voice hollow. "A permanent end." Suddenly, the boy gasped and curled into a ball, his hands over his ears. "They're coming! The quiet men! They walk through the walls." Miller and the medic spun around. The cellar was empty. But from upstairs, in the ruined church, they heard the soft crunch of boots on rubble, not the heavy tread of German soldiers. The stealthy, deliberate steps of professionals, Albright's men. They had found him. There was no back way out. They were trapped. Miller drew his sidearm, the only weapon he had left. The medic picked up a rifle leaning against the wall. It was a hopeless fight. The footsteps reached the top of the cellar stairs. A shadow fell across the doorway. Then a sound, a single, pure, clear note. It was the boy. He had stopped rocking. He was sitting up straight, his mouth open, emitting a tone that was not a song, but a solid, resonant wave of sound. It was the opposite of the Kronos compound's destructive silence. It was a sound of order, of stability. The air in the cellar shimmered. The quiet men at the top of the stairs cried out in shock and confusion. Miller saw their forms distort, flicker, as if they were a radio signal losing reception. The boy was fighting them, using his own innate connection to time to disrupt theirs. The note held for 10 seconds, 20. Then, the boy collapsed, unconscious. The shimmering stopped. The air was still. Cautiously, Miller climbed the cellar stairs. The church was empty. No sign of the quiet men. It was as if they had never been there. He looked back at the boy. The child had given him a chance. A fighting chance. He had also given him the final piece of the puzzle. The Avalon group, and men like Albright, weren't just trying to weaponize time. They were trying to silence it, to create a static, controlled, and dead world. He helped the medic carry the boy to a safer location. Then, he turned north. He would not go to the British. He could not trust any official channel. He had to disappear. The film in his camera was not just evidence. It was a testament, a record of a betrayal not just of a nation, but of reality itself. The tiny explosive seeds had been the beginning. The silent destruction of planes was just a precursor to the silent destruction of everything. Captain Miller melted into the French countryside, a ghost with a secret. His war was no longer against the Germans. It was against the coming silence, and he was the only one who knew it was coming.